Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Semoto Podcast. Today with us, Bill Okello from Kenya. He runs the Okello Kiume Advocates, a law firm in Kenya, but specialized in the coverage of all Africa. Bill, welcome with us. Thanks
Nice
for
to be
joining
here,
us.
Marco. Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure, Bill. So we had a nice chat before starting the podcast. I'm really looking forward for this episode. Bill is going to give us an all overview of what regulation and the overall regulatory framework looks like across Africa. Before starting, Bill, tell us about your law firm, what you guys do. Give us a bit of an intro.
Thank you, Marco. So, as you had mentioned, I am partner at Okello Kiume Advocates, which is a law firm based in Nairobi, Kenya. We help blockchain companies and crypto companies with regulatory compliance, licensing, corporate management, and cross-border operations across African countries. So, to sum it all up, anything that has to do with legal, we can handle it.
Amazing. Thanks, Bill. Now, in Europe, even a US level, we are seeing a lot of different regulatory framework when it comes to different states, different countries. Let me ask you a couple of questions. When it comes to Africa, what are the most common jurisdictions that you see that to be crypto friendly, to be more open to business? And second of all, if you have to give us a bit of a regulatory map, what are the differentiator between these countries?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Now, different African countries have tried or are trying to regulate the virtual asset space or the blockchain space as it comes up. However, I have seen that the major jurisdictions here in Africa are three. So there are three major jurisdictions that companies usually look at when they want to enter Africa, and that is Nigeria, which is the largest market, which is the largest crypto market. Then there's South Africa, and then there's Kenya. So these markets are not only are they major players, but they're also gateways to other countries. That's why they are very interesting. So with South Africa, they have started licensing virtual asset service providers. And we've seen also a similar thing in Nigeria, which is like a turnaround from what we saw happen with Binance when they were fighting virtual assets companies. But yeah, they've done a complete turnaround, and right now they are inviting them and they're accepting virtual asset companies. A company such as, there's an exchange called Busha, which is fully licensed in Nigeria, and they're accepting other virtual asset service providers. Now, in Kenya, we do not yet have a regulation that regulates this space. However, there's some good news. There has been a proposed draft bill by our treasury, by the National Treasury, that intends on regulating virtual asset service providers. So this is some great news. They just did the public participation and stakeholder engagement, which I was actively involved in, and we gave our recommendations on the bill. So something to look forward to this year, and it's quite progressive.
That's great news. And give us a bit of color on this bill. I mean, what is involved? Before, me and you were discussing about MiCA over here in Europe. Do you see some similarities to it, or are you guys looking into what regulators over in Europe and US are doing, or you see a different path?
Now, before this bill was drafted, they looked at different jurisdictions, including the US, more advanced jurisdictions such as Singapore, Japan, which have already regulated the sector. And of course, they also looked at MiCA, which is one of the main laws to look at while regulating this sector. And MiCA is very, very elaborate. I'd say with our bill, it is not as elaborate as MiCA. MiCA regulates even the nitty-gritties, if you know what I mean. But the approach that we have decided to take, or rather that the Kenyan government has decided to take with this draft virtual asset service providers bill, is to regulate the supermarket rather than the shelf. So rather than the items on the shelf. So what I mean by this is they regulate the service providers. So those are the virtual asset service providers, instead of regulating each individual token by itself.
Interesting. Okay, that's an interesting approach. So obviously the burden stays with the company being regulated. So there is not that debate that like in the US is Ethereum a commodity or not. So, okay, interesting. But what about more investment related product? Like, for example, there is a view on staking, even in other jurisdiction. How has that been addressed, for example?
Now, that's very interesting. In our draft bill, what they intend to regulate, it is actually the function of, how can I put this better? They regulate what the virtual asset service provider is doing. So depending on what you're doing, if you're doing payments, if you're doing investments, you will have a different regulate. You'll have a regulator that is already regulating something similar in the traditional finance space. So, for example, if you are, let's say, you're tokenizing real estate, there's already a similar regulator, which is the Capital Markets Authority that regulates securities. And now the Capital Markets Authority here in Kenya will be your regulator for tokenizing real estate. However, if you are doing payments, cross-border transfer using stablecoins, then you will be regulated by our central bank, and they will be the one issuing you with the license, because they already regulate similar entities in traditional finance which do cross-border transfer. So that is the approach that Kenya has decided to take, and we also see that South Africa also decided to take a similar approach instead of coming up with a completely new regulator that regulate virtual assets. So they just regulate the service rather than come up with a whole new regulatory body.
Got it. Got it. You touch on real estate is a topic that I wanted to cover here at Semoto, where we've seen a lot of interest from clients in real world assets covering Africa, both land, properties, minerals. So is a topic that I think is quite interesting to cover. Before moving on, I mean, let's consider these three jurisdictions that you mentioned: Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa. So if you can give us the main
Yes.
difference between the three for a company entering the space, I mean, what are the scenarios that companies are going to face differently per country?
Yes, great question. So within the three countries, the most advanced would be South Africa, because they started regulation much earlier than the other two. So with South Africa, they already know what services that usually virtual asset service providers provide, or what services are built on blockchain and how to regulate them. They understand it a bit better. Someone would have a smoother time applying for a license in South Africa. When it comes to Nigeria, yes, they did have their wrangles, but it seems like they've become now more open and are actually accepting these businesses to come into Nigeria. And it's just a thing of having some contextual intelligence and engaging someone who knows the market. An example is like Okello and Kiume. At Okello and Kiume, we are partnered with a big law firm in Nigeria that has capabilities and the know-how to deal with blockchain companies and virtual asset service providers, and also has networks that will help you navigate the Nigerian market. And when it comes to Kenya, I mentioned that there's just been the bill. The bill has not yet been tabled in Parliament, so at the moment there is no regulation for virtual assets. However, regulation is imminent because this bill is direct from our Treasury. So
So it's a matter of
there
time.
is an intent. Yes, there is an intention to pass this bill by the second quarter. If it goes through our parliament and it is passed, it will probably be passed by the second quarter. And I have read the bill myself. Of course, it needs some adjustments, but it is a bill that is very progressive. We pass this bill. I know I am a bit biased, but Kenya might just be the leader in the space.
Nice, interesting. I mean, obviously, it will open a lot of opportunities and bring more stability to the industry. What about the other countries, Bill, though? Because I do agree. I mean, it's exactly the flow that we are seeing when chatting with clients or when chatting with companies with an appetite
Yeah.
for Africa. Those are exactly the three jurisdictions that we are seeing. Do you see growth in other jurisdictions as well? Do you see those countries going and copy the bill that you just passed? What's your view?
Yes, now I previously mentioned that the reason why people approach these countries is like they are the gateway to Africa. Nigeria is in West Africa, Kenya is in East Africa, and of course South Africa is in the southern part of Africa. These three countries usually lead the trend. So once they have passed something, and when they agree on something, most countries usually follow suit. So we've
Okay.
seen this with the different things, including the Data Protection Act, let's say here in Kenya, once it was passed, other countries started passing a similar thing. So it is very important for these countries to even not only pass their own regulation, but also to work together in tandem to even have passportability of licenses. Because once this is possible, it opens up the rest of the African markets.
Interesting. And
Yeah,
I was actually surprised. Sorry, go on.
yeah, just to finish that thought, for example, to be specific, Kenya is usually the trendsetter here in East Africa. So if we pass something progressive such as a virtual asset service providers bill, our neighbors such as Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, they will be interested and start looking into it. And if it's something that they see that is also fit for their country, then they will also pass something similar.
Interesting. We were fascinated actually about the fact that all the growth, it seems to come from, again, those three countries, while we are not seeing much movement in North Africa. Historically, with other regulation and policies, he always sees that they keep an eye on what English law or even more French law is doing by obviously historical connection. When it comes to crypto, we don't see much adoption. Do you have any view on North Africa?
With North Africa, they usually tend to follow what other Arabic countries are doing, and we've seen that some countries have completely banned crypto, and I do not want to speak much on them because I do not have the contextual intelligence for those countries,
No,
but
totally
we have
understandable.
not seen.
No, I mean, obviously, I mean, it's we're trying to cover an entire continent in just a short podcast, so it's quite hard to cover everything. But it's so fascinating, obviously, because that is where, and Nigeria, I think, is the perfect example. The high level of adoption, it comes from a true need of the people. It really goes back to the origin of why cryptocurrencies are so important, to have access to
Yes,
digital assets, to be able to protect yourself, your family, your business from inflation. So it really goes back to the core beliefs of why the whole industry, the whole
yes,
space started. What about,
yes.
sorry, please.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because if you look at Africa, the majority adoption of virtual assets, the major adoption is on stablecoins. Now, why is this so? It's exactly what you have just explained. There is currency devaluation, and people want to protect the value of their currency. Traditional finance makes it hard to get your hands on physical dollars. Now, stablecoins such as USDC and USDT have become more accessible than getting dollars from your bank because I can just get on an exchange and just swap my local currency for stablecoins. And this has driven mass adoption. And of course, also with cross-border transactions. In the West, these things work very seamlessly, but here in Africa and also in Latin America, sometimes you have something like a dollar shortage, and even businesses are unable to transact if they buy goods cross border because they buy those goods using the dollar. Now, if they cannot get access to the dollar, they turn to payment companies that are utilizing stablecoins, and with that, now they are able to buy their goods, and there is no dollar shortage in crypto.
fascinating, but and I absolutely love it because, in my opinion, one of the biggest issue that we're facing in Web3 is that the whole focus is on the speculative aspect of it, how to make a quick bucks out of trading crypto, while in
Yes,
Southeast Asia, in South America, in countries across Africa, we are seeing it being brought back to the core of what is supposed to do, support an economy, support the ecosystem, and it's fascinating. We covered the regulation, but obviously regulation is driven by demand and adoption. So how do you see the ecosystem when it comes to adopting, embracing crypto? Do you see, you mentioned that obviously Nigeria is the largest country for adoption, but do you see the Kenyan ecosystem growing, startup wise, projects? Where do you see the majority of the interest? Stablecoin, RWA, DPIN? What's your view?
now there's a lot of interest also here in Kenya. At a time, I think Kenya has had the highest P2P peer-to-peer transactions. It was one of the top in the world at some point. And there's a huge interest in digital assets or virtual assets here in Kenya, both speculatively and also just on someone wanting to hold their value. Started seeing that even traditional finance have started inquiring on what are these virtual assets and how can it help them. Now, someone like I usually believe that the future is usually already here, just in a different jurisdiction. And what do I mean by that? I mean countries such as Mexico have already adopted USDC at the bank level. Banks are partnering with stablecoin issuers for cross-border transactions. Now, if you see something happening, it's of course solving a problem. Now, something similar can also happen in African countries where face similar problems. A country such as Malawi right now is having a massive dollar shortage. Their currency is seriously devaluating. Businesses are crying out for dollars. People want to move money and they can't. Now, stablecoins solve this issue. USD-backed stablecoins would really help them if they just have the technical know-how and the willingness to utilize virtual assets. Now, back to Kenya. There are a lot of startups. In fact, there are usually a lot of events, crypto events. So we've seen the Africa Bitcoin conference, which recently happened last year. It was graced by names like Jack Dorsey. We've seen people like Jesse Pollack who've come here to Kenya from Base, who also want to have an interest in this jurisdiction. And one of the major key players why Kenya is so important is that on digital payments and on mobile payments, Kenya is the leader in the world. I think, Marco, you should come to Kenya, and I'll show you how to use M-Pesa. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It is very smooth, very seamless.
I'll take you on that invite for sure.
People are usually surprised on just how efficient it is, and we're already used to making payments on our phones. So even moving to just virtual assets and using these apps, it is very easy. Then you don't have to first educate people on how do you use these apps. No, it's just plug and play as long as someone sees the value. So yes, the demand is increasing as more people learn about virtual assets. And already at this point, it's believed that Kenyans holding virtual assets are around 6 million. And I believe the number is just growing and growing.
Interesting. Before, Bill, we were talking about, we briefly mentioned RWA.
Yes.
I don't know if it's just at Semoto or if you share the view, but we have seen an exponential growth in projects, not just from Africa, but from across the world, looking in Africa with the RWA angle in mind. So tokenizing land, tokenizing resources, tokenizing properties. What's your view on that? And for people that have an appetite, what is the regulatory framework? I mean, can foreigner company freely invest in properties? What's the general ecosystem look like?
Thank you for that question. Tokenization is big. It's huge. I think it's one of the major sectors in blockchain and in virtual assets. And Kenya is very open and willing to accept these companies and to also regulate them. So, for example, at the moment, we have something called a sandbox in our Capital Markets Authority. So that's the SEC similar here in Kenya. And in the sandbox, they've actually admitted two companies. They've already admitted two companies that are doing real estate tokenization. And they are now of course, they are in the sandbox, but once you're in the sandbox, it's almost as if you're regulated because the regulator is supervising your operations and to just see how it works. And once they graduate from the sandbox, they will come up with more elaborate regulations on how to regulate the sector. But it has been very open. One thing that would interest you also is that even our securities exchange is called the Nairobi Securities Exchange. It's also very interested in tokenization, and it is a part of the Hedera Council.
Okay.
You know the Hedera?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, yes. Our Nairobi Securities Exchange is part of that council. So that just shows you a body as big as that. That's our New York Stock Exchange, if I were to compare. A body that is that big, being part of a council means that the country actually wants to embrace.
Yeah, no, exactly. You're right. That shows a lot about the overall view of the country for future adoption. That's fascinating.
Yes. And one thing I forgot to mention is that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please, absolutely finish.
I think I forgot to mention is that the current draft bill also includes virtual assets that want to tokenize real world assets. So that's from tokenizing real estate, tokenizing coffee, tokenizing whatever you want to tokenize. And their regulator, if the bill passes, their regulator will be the Capital Markets Authority. And we have companies, as I mentioned, that are already doing tokenization. So the ones that are in the sandbox are tokenizing real estate, but we also have some that have tokenized coffee, some that are trying to tokenize gold. They are not yet in the sandbox, but they do exist in the Kenyan ecosystem.
Okay, got it. Interesting that. Let's jump in the shoes of a company that wants to open up in Africa. So let's say
Yes.
a company that wants to expand their business to the African market, and they obviously fall under VASP regulatory framework. What is the roadmap from a legal point of view of what they should do, from potentially creating a separate company to facing the regulator? So give us a bit of a shopping list of what they should do before setting up in Africa, and what are the common mistakes that you have seen company doing when trying to launch in the African market?
Yes. So that question, it highly depends on the jurisdiction, and I think I'm fit to speak best about the
Yeah,
Kenyan
let's cover
jurisdiction,
Kenya,
just as an
absolutely.
example. And yeah, yeah, some things apply cross board, but let's start with Kenya. So at the moment, is first, when you enter a country, you need to determine, do they regulate virtual assets, or is there regulation, or is there no regulation? That is number one. Once you determine if there is or there isn't a regulation, number two is you have to look at, you need to have some contextual intelligence. How have they reacted towards virtual assets and virtual asset regulation? What is the mood in that country? Because that is something that is extremely important to note. So if there is regulation, of course, the mood is that it's okay. You can just come in and get a license. So if there is regulation, you need to get licensed. So you need to approach law firms such as Okello Kiume, or someone who knows what they're doing. My suggestion is to approach law firms that specifically deal with virtual assets, because this is a field that you need someone who understands it. You need someone who understands what you're doing. If we've seen some people, you mentioned mistakes, we've seen some companies that once they enter a market, they ask, because they have the funding for it, what is the biggest law firm here in this country? I want to get regulated. And of course, you will be recommended to a big law firm, and that big law firm does not necessarily know anything about virtual assets. They deal
I
with mergers and acquisitions.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, that goes hand in hand with why we built Semoto. In Europe, in US, we see the
Yeah,
same mistakes. Bill, I promise you, people go to the huge law firm just for the brand, and they don't realize that they might chat with somebody that never touched virtual assets in their life.
exactly. I've had companies come to me and say, this and this law firm messed me up. I came into Kenya, we took them, and these guys have no idea, no clue what they're doing. I've also had some top law firms which I consult for. They are like, we have this client wants this. We don't understand what they want, but help us.
No, no, I
Yes,
hear you.
so choosing a law firm, yeah, choosing the right law firm is also very important. Now, the law firm will help you with getting the license. Now, let's go back to the contextual intelligence. Why do I say this? For example, if I was to use a well-known example here in Kenya, companies such as WorldCoin. WorldCoin came into Kenya. They actually launched. WorldCoin was launched. Their first initial launch was here in Kenya.
Didn't know that.
So yes, the major reason for that is just the mobile intake and the mobile payments that I had mentioned, and also, of course, internet penetration is quite high in Kenya. Almost everyone has a smartphone. Anyway, so when they launched, they were giving, of course, they were scanning your eyeball with their orb, and then they were giving you an airdrop, and the airdrop was around 7,000 Kenya shillings, which to a normal individual here in Kenya is a lot of money to make in a few minutes. Where just I line up, send my eyeball, and then you give me 7,000. And they weren't discriminating on that you have to be of a certain social class or anything. So anyone from the guy who's parked his Mercedes outside to the guy who just came with his bicycle are all getting 7,000. Now, of course, there was a huge frenzy. Everyone was lining up to get this 7,000, and the government came in. They were like, what company is this that is giving free money? Now, where where I believe they made a mistake is that they were not well advised on the fact that they did not approach the proper channels, first of all, when entering the market, and second, that the perception of it would be taken wrongly, because they were giving an airdrop. People, us in the space, we know what an airdrop is. However, if you tell someone in government or the police officers that there is a company that is scanning eyes and
It
giving
screams money
7,000.
laundering, and you raise red flags right left.
Exactly. And why are you giving free money? Where is this free money coming from? Which company just gives that amount of money? 7,000 shillings is around, give or take, $650.
Okay.
No, not 650, sorry, $65. $65.
Okay.
So giving $65 to anyone and everyone for scanning their eyes. Where are you taking these scans? Are you selling our eye scans for more? Why are you giving everyone this money?
Yeah, man, all legit
Depending on what you
question. But as you said, even at government
Yes.
level, if you're not well advised on what is an airdrop, what is this company planning to do, it's hard to understand, and it's understandable for sure.
Exactly. Now, if you just go and do it without actually, first of all, having engagements with these sort of people and just explaining to them, this is what is happening, this is where this money is coming from, because it seems like you're giving away free money, but what was actually happening is that you get an airdrop, and then you come to me, I want to buy your WorldCoin, and then I will give you the 7,000 Kenya shillings. It doesn't just magically appear from somewhere, and then all of a sudden you have 7,000 Kenya shillings. If they did have some contextual intelligence, I believe they would have handled that much better.
Bill, one final question.
Let me not go on that. Yes.
Out of curiosity, one of the elements that sometimes put people off in dealing with certain jurisdiction, and I'm not just talking about African countries. I'm Italian. We invented slow bureaucracy, but it is what it pushed people. It was a lot of investors, a lot of companies away, right? I'm not going to hold you on this one, don't worry, but what do you think is a realistic time frame to set up a business getting regulated in Kenya?
Okay, that's interesting. Of course, bureaucracy is everywhere. In the context of virtual asset service providers, I don't really.
Okay, that's generous. We're seeing the same in Europe, across Europe. To be honest, FCA in UK, unfortunately, is getting slower and slower. It's a matter of, as you said, sometimes the government doesn't have exactly the right knowledge to face certain type of requests. Sometimes they're just bombarded with multiple requests and they cannot cope to. So I think it's standard across the globe, to be honest. Okay, Bill, I want to thank you for taking the time, first of all, to be the first member from Kenya on the Semoto platform. We are extremely excited to have you with us. For us, it's great. Africa is such an important market for us, and with you, it gave us a chance to open up to an entire new ecosystem. So we really hope to do more and more business with you. At the bottom of this podcast, people will be able to see your profile on Semoto. My message to the audience is, if you're growing in Web3, you cannot ignore the African market. The potential is huge, but as we said during this podcast, it has to be done properly with the right experts. So please get in contact with Okello Kiume. Bill, thanks a lot. I'll let you finish. Thanks a lot, Bill. Speak soon.